To His Royal Highness Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, Earl of Inverness, Baron of Arklow, Knight of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, President of the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, Colonel of the Honorable Artillery Company, Most Worshipful Grand Master of Masons, etc., etc., etc. These lectures are, by permission, inscribed with the sentiments of the most profound respect and attachment by His Royal Highness's obliged and most devoted humble servant, George Oliver, D.D. Preface. Impressed with a due sense of the high degree of responsibility which is incurred by an attempt to illustrate the science of Masonry, I submit the following sheets to my brethren in the confidence of hope that I have succeeded in placing the light in so luminous a point of view that, like the glorious pillar which conducted the children of Israel safely out of Egypt, it will enlighten the true Mason, without affording a single ray to assist the forbidden investigations of those who have a desire to penetrate the arcana of Masonry, without submitting to the legitimate process of initiation. With pure intentions, I have used my utmost endeavors to conceal from prying eyes of uninitiated curiosity those essential points which have constituted Masonry into an exclusive system, and will remain an impenetrable barrier between its professors and the world to the end of time. Some passages may be found whose ultimate sense will even be unintelligible to the ordinary Mason, and known only to him who has been exalted to the royal arch. It is hoped that the assiduous brother, by the perusal of these pages, will be able to add considerably to his stock of knowledge on this comprehensive subject. He will find in the high antiquity of those emblems, where all the beauties of Masonry lie concealed, new reasons for admiring the judicious mechanism and the refined morality of the science, and will conduct his researches with renewed alacrity and spirit on discovering that the very same symbols have been used for a similar purpose by every nation and people, and in all the secret institutions which have existed from the creation to the present time. In tracing the antiquity of these significant emblems, we are necessarily plunged deeply into the mysteries of ancient nations, which, though founded on the principles of primitive Masonry and using the same symbolical imagery, were not productive of the same results, because there existed a radical defect in their formation, which blighted every genial principle and counteracted the efficacy of emblematical instruction, which has an express tendency to soften the manners and humanize the heart. They were established for the purpose of placing a secret and uncontrollable power in the hands of the hierophants and mystagogues, and hence every means was resorted to which might extend their influence or increase their popularity. These purposes being foreign to the primitive design, innovation followed innovation, each succeeding change being a retrograde movement from original purity until, instead of a mild and benevolent religion, thus renounced by gradual steps to make room for superstitions more splendid and imposing, their rites of divine worship became fierce and bloody, implacable and severe, and this produced a corresponding change in the disposition of the heart. Instead of the cheering ray of hope, from which comfort and consolation were derived by the ancient professors of pure Masonry, under the pressure of adversity, the degenerate race were bowed down with sadness and despair. The place of pure devotion was usurped by obscene rites and ceremonial observances. In a word, light was rejected, and an unfathomable darkness had taken possession of the soul. Hence, severe penances were instituted, which the wretched sufferers were taught to believe would propitiate the wrath of heaven, and hence arose also, united with the perverted meaning of an ancient prophecy, the horrid custom of sanguinary sacrifices, in which the polluted altars of the gods were stained with human gore. The mysteries of Egypt contained all the secrets of their religion and politics, and inspired dread and terror throughout the world. By the uninitiated, they were regarded as vehicles of knowledge more than human, and the dispensers of them were reputed to possess some high and peculiar attributes of the divinity. The initiated themselves were struck with a sacred horror at the recollection of that awful solemnity which attended their own initiation, and dared not even to name or refer to them in familiar conversation, lest their indiscretion should elicit the summary vengeance of the justly offended deities. When Grecian philosophy began to prevail, the mysteries were applied by wise men to the purpose of inquiring more particularly after the nature and attributes of the deity, which through a legitimate pursuit of primitive masonry had yielded to the introduction of popular innovations until the truth was obscured under a mass of absurdity and fable. Their bold disquisitions varied from the monotony of ancient practice, and differed essentially from each other, whence many distinctive varieties were introduced into the lodges or schools, which never before existed, and the doctrines were diversified according to the speculative opinions of each principal superintendent. These schools bore every character of Masonry, except that one grand and distinguished characteristic, which confers life and vigor on all its proceedings, the true knowledge and worship of the deity. It is highly probable that these philosophers had some faint knowledge of the true God, but they did not worship him as God, preferring the creature to the creator. And in the lesser mysteries, they substituted a rabble or false deities to his total exclusion. In taking a brief view of this succanatum for Masonry, as it existed in every nation of the world before the coming of Jesus Christ, we may see to what a skeleton of dry bones it was reduced when forsaken by the Spirit. After Pythagoras had newly modeled the mysteries and different sects of Masons or philosophers, for Pythagoras gave the name of philosophy as well as the mesurano to our science, began to entertain new and irreconcilable opinions on the subject of research. Their speculations were carried on in each lodge with eager avidity, but without adopting a selfish system of exclusion. Each body was in the highest degree communicative. Its members were ever ready to instruct others in their peculiar dogmas, and all united in the common pursuit of searching after truth. They had very indistinct notions of the true God, though his name was not unknown to them, and entertaining gross and sensual ideas of his nature. It is no wonder that vice became deified, and that the commission of every unnatural lust was not only permitted, but even made a test of reverence to the deity. Mercy was by one converted into a vice by another. Adultery was sanctified, and fornication and suicide were the common practice of all. Thus, the purity of Masonry fled from these institutions as they retrograded from the true worship of God, and this purity it was that they in vain endeavored to recover. They practiced vice, but then they thought that it was virtue. They practiced the worship of false gods or demons, but they verily thought until the latter ages, when a few sects dissented from the belief that they were performing a service acceptable to God by practicing the rites of true religion through the intervention of mediators. And hence it is easy to demonstrate not only that Masonry as practiced by Jews and Christians, but also that every resemblance of it in all parts of the world was professedly, if not practically, devoted to the perfecting of man's mental powers, that he might pass through a life of virtue here, to the full enjoyment of it in a future state. Under what denomination soever our science has been known in the world, under what form soever it may have been practiced from the fall of man to the present time, it has always been understood to have a distinct reference to the worship of God and the moral culture of man, whether it were received under the appellation of farce, lux, synagogue, mystery, philosophy, mezzoranio, or masonry, whether practiced by the antediluvians, the patriarchs, the idolaters, the Jews, the Essenes, or the Christians. In all ages and among all people, it possessed the same reference to the prominent truths of the religion. The idolatrous mysteries, which were the most perfect imitation of Masonry that could be practiced by those who had renounced its distinguishing principles along with the true worship of God, were founded to preserve amongst mankind the nominal practice of religion. Although the incense might be offered to demons on an idolatrous altar, and they were usually celebrated in conjunction with the rites of divine worship. Thus were they generally applied to the purpose of perpetuating a knowledge of the divinity and the doctrine of a future state of rewards and punishments, as well as to fix in the minds of the uninitiated vulgar a deep and solemn reverence for the duties of religion. It is scarcely necessary to enlarge on this point, because the fact is universally notorious, nor shall I discuss the unessential difference in each of these mysteries, as that would involve many useless repetitions, for their nature and object were universally the same. The characteristic propensities of a people, the state of their progress from barbarism to civilization, their intellectual attainments, the character of their government or their intercourse with other nations might and did create some distinction in the ceremonial, but the great essentials broadly struck out by the Siberic priest did never vary. The same primary doctrines remained in the reign of Theodosius, which were inculcated by the founders, though the ceremonial had become polluted with every species of abomination and uncleanliness. If Masonry or its idolatrous substitute be considered under the worst and most forbidding forms, it invariably preserved the moral dogmas and institutes of each national religion. It is true that false religion produced false Masonry, and the latter, faithful to the principles by which it was supported, proceeded no farther than an idolatrous worship would sanction. In a word, the mysteries were the only vehicles of religion throughout the whole idolatrous world, and it is probable that the very name of religion might have been obliterated from amongst them, but for the support it received by the periodical celebrations which preserved all the forms and ceremonies, rites and practices of divine worship, and the varieties of custom in this particular, constituted the sole difference betwixt the Masonry, shall I so call it, of different nations. Wheresoever the mysteries were introduced, they retained their primitive form, adapted to the customs and usages of the national religion, and if varied in some unimportant points, it was to commemorate certain extraordinary performances of the tutelary deities, or to perpetuate some remarkable circumstance attending their first institution in a particular country. Hence the same or similar ceremonies, which were applied to Osiris and Isis in Egypt, the great source of secret and mysterious rites, were celebrated in Greece in honor of Bacchus and Rhea. At Eleusis, they were applied to Ceres and Proserpine. In Tyre and Cyprus, to Adonis and Venus. In Persia, to Mithras and Mithra. In India, to Mahadeva and Sita. In Britain, to Hu and Cerduin. In Scandinavia, to Odin and Freya. and in Mexico to Tlaloc and the Great Mother, for these appear to be but different names for the same deities, and most probably refer to Noah and the Ark. They were all originally the same system, founded on primitive masonry, but being deteriorated by false worship, bore a very imperfect resemblance to the divine pattern. They all, however, preserved a distinguished tradition of the creation and fall of man and the universal deluge. They used as most significant emblems the theological ladder, the triple support of the universal lodge, called by Masons wisdom, strength, and beauty, the point within a circle, and many other legitimate emblems of Masonry. They used the same form of government, the same system of secrecy, allegory, and symbolical instruction, all tending to the same point, the practice of moral virtue. None were admitted without previous probation and initiation. The candidates were bound by solemn oaths, united by invisible ties, taught by symbols, distinguished by signs and tokens, and impelled by a conscientious adherence to the rules of the order. They professed to practice the most rigid morality, justice toward men, and piety toward the gods. In treating on all the points connected with these symbols, I trust it will be acknowledged that in this course of lectures I have not removed the veil which conceals a single forbidden secret, that I have not exposed to the public gaze a single word, letter, or character which may tend to excite sensations of alarm in the bosom of the most rigid and tenacious Mason, but that I have endeavored modestly to illustrate such points and symbols as may show the beauty of the system, and convince mankind at large that Masonry is really what it professes to be, an order of peace, harmony, and brotherly love. I have been scrupulously careful about the admission of a single sentence from the peculiar Lectures of Masonry which has not already appeared in a printed form in one or other of our legitimate publications. It is true, the following pages contain much genuine Masonry, but it is not marked by the use of a distinguishing type, and is distributed with so much precaution as to render fruitless the attempt of an uninitiated person to determine where it is concealed, while to the assiduous Mason's view it lies open and exposed. To him it is like a burning and a shining light, elevated on a lofty candlestick, and darting its pure and perfect ways to enlighten and invigorate the soul. I conclude this preface in the words of Brother Wellens Calcutt, who published some disquisitions on Freemasonry in 1769. However anxious and restless the busy and invidious may be, and whatever attempts they may make to traduce our institution or discover our mysteries, all their endeavors will prove ineffectual. They will still find that the only means to attain to the knowledge of our mysteries, our abilities, integrity, firmness, and a due and constant perseverance in the great duties of moral and social life, and principles of religion and virtue, and whatever is commendable and praiseworthy. These are the steps, and this the clue, that will lead and direct the practices of such excellencies to the heights of Freemasonry, and while they adhere to them, will effectually secure them favor and esteem from every able and faithful brother, and the warmth, approbation, and satisfaction from their own hearts. Signs and Symbols, Lecture 1, on the hieroglyphical system of the ancients. When first the golden morn aloft, with maiden breezes whispering soft, sprung from the east with rosy wing, to kiss the heavenly firstborn spring, Jehovah then from hallowed earth gave masonry immortal birth. Masonic Ode. Study eagerly the meaning of the hieroglyphs and emblems which the order lays before thee. Even nature does not always unveil her secrets. She must be observed, compared, and frequently watched with attention in her operations. Masonic Exhortations from the German. It has long been my opinion that the most beneficial results would ensue to the science of Freemasonry, were the masters of lodges to devote some portion of their time to the delivery of explanatory lectures on subjects of general interest connected with the institution. Such a practice might be the means of elucidating many points on which our customary lectures leave us entirely in the dark. Some years ago, a law emanating from the MWGM passed the Grand Lodge, empowering every master to deliver his lectures in a language suited to the character of the lodge over which he presides, with this only proviso, that the established landmarks be not removed. This liberal regulation leaves the local discussions of our lodges open to considerable improvement, and relieves us from the shackles of a constituted form whose unwavering features, beautiful as they are, after a few years' habitual repetition become to a certain extent uninteresting. For every human composition, how superior soever it may be, palls on the mind when the charm of novelty has faded away, and, at a still more distant period, its salutary impression ceases altogether. But a provision like that I have just referred to constitute a Masonic lodge into a literary society, where every member is at liberty to add to the general stock of knowledge by promulgating the results of his own inquiries and disseminating among the brethren the fruits of his researches in our ancient and scientific institution. Masonry contains many points to which such inquiries may be usefully directed. I shall suggest a few in the course of these lectures and state how far my own observations have extended. One important question which appears to have been almost wholly neglected by Masonic writers is whether Freemasonry be a servile imitation of certain ceremonies in the ancient idolatrous mysteries, as is asserted by some writers, or whether it be the great original from which the mysteries themselves were derived. On this inquiry, I have bestowed much deliberate consideration, for I found it impossible to be satisfied with practicing a science derived from the polluted dregs of idolatry. To investigate this important point fully and impartially, I have consulted most of the principal mythological writers, both ancient and modern, whose works are accessible and possess either interest or authority. I have examined with the greatest attention the mysterious establishments of all nations in the world, and have bestowed infinite pains in collecting from the institutions of antiquity the peculiar ceremonies of initiation, as well as the date of their origin, their doctrines, usages, and customs, in the hope of elucidating this most abstruse point, and detecting the fallacy of those pretensions to originality which were exhibited in the practice of idolatrous rites in various heathen nations. The result of this investigation has introduced into my mind a firm persuasion that Freemasonry is not as some others seem to think, a scion snatched with a violent hand from the ancient mysteries, but in reality the original institution from which all the mysteries were derived, because from their agreement in certain essential points which could only be obtained from a system of purity and truth, we derive ample testimony to establish the fact that the mysteries of all nations were originally the same, and diversified only by the accidental circumstances of local situation and political economy. I admit without hesitation that Masonry and the mysteries bear many characteristics in common, which point out a common origination. But by tracing the latter to their source, separating the component parts with a careful hand, and minutely analyzing every occult rite and mystic ceremony, it will clearly appear that they owe their origin to the pure science which we now practice under the designation of Freemasonry. The true system of divine worship had its accompanying institution of mystery, which was coeval with religion and essential to its support. This arrangement was copied by the idolaters, whose newly established plans of worship were always accompanied by corresponding systems of mystery, formed on the same basis and embracing the same principles as the pure system which was attached to the primitive religion. As therefore the true preceded the false religion, so the institution now called Masonry was anterior to the establishment of the mysteries. It is true, many impediments exist to prevent a clear and satisfactory elucidation of the institutions of antiquity. The greater portion of the ancient authors who mention them appear to have been under the high restraint of that awful secrecy which the initiated were bound to serve, and consequently many of the secrets and usages remain undiscovered. Enough, however, may be collected to convince us of their common origination, and certain ceremonies and symbols which bear a striking resemblance to the rites of Freemasonry may be traced in these institutions, amidst the heterogeneous mass of profaneness and impiety, which rendered the celebration at once disgraceful and obscene. The rites of that science which is now received under the appellation of Freemasonry were exercised in the antediluvian world, revived by Noah after the flood, practiced by mankind at the building of Babel, conveniences for which were undoubtedly contrived in the interior of that celebrated edifice, and at the dispersion spread with every settlement, already deteriorated by the gradual innovations of the Sybaric priest, and modeled into a form, the great outlines of which are distinctively to be traced in the mysteries of every heathen nation, exhibiting the shattered remains of one true system, whence they were all derived. The rites of idolatry were indeed strikingly similar, and generally deduced from parallel practices previously used by the true Masons, for idolatry was an imitative system, and all its ceremonies and doctrines were founded on the general principles of the patriarchal religion. If the patriarch united in his own person the three offices of king, priest, and prophet, the secret assemblies of idolatry were also governed by a triad, consisting of three supreme officers. If primitive Masonry was a system of light, the initiated heathen equally paid divine honors to the sun as the source of light, by circumambulating in the course of that luminary during the ceremony of initiation. The uniformity of practice which attended the progress of error in different nations is truly astonishing. They equally used the Ambrosiae Petrae as vehicles of regeneration. They shrouded their rites under the same impenetrable mask of secrecy. They possessed the same mode of conveying instruction by symbols, allegory, and fable, the same repugnance to committing their abstruse secrets to writing, the same system of morality, the same attachment to amulets, talismans, and perhaps magic, and equally inculcated the immortality of the soul and a future state of rewards and punishments, which were alike pantomimically exhibited during the initiations. The departure from Freemasonry was indeed at its original corruption, but slightly marked. The object was changed by the substitution of surreptitious deities, but the ceremonial remained nearly the same. It was only by successive and in some instances very remote innovations that the system at length assumed a different character, and even at its last and most corrupted change, many striking points of resemblance may be traced, which unequivocally denote a common origination. Hence, however the mysteries of different nations might vary in ceremonial observances, they contain certain arbitrary landmarks, which are unquestionable evidences that they were derived from some true and primitive system, for they were nothing but masonry or lux, gradually perverted to the corrupt purposes of a false and spurious worship. The system of hieroglyphics or symbols, which is proposed for illustration in these lectures, was adopted into every mysterious institution, for the purpose of concealing the most sublime secrets of religion from the prying curiosity of the vulgar, to whom nothing was exposed but the beauties of their morality. The old Asiatic style, so highly figurative, seems, by what we find of its remains in the prophetic language of the sacred writers, to have been evidently fashioned to the mode of the ancient hieroglyphs. For as in hieroglyphic writing, the sun, moon, and stars were used to represent states and empires, kings and queens, and nobility. The eclipse and extinction, temporary disasters or entire overthrow, fire and flood, desolation by war and famine, plants or animals, the qualities of particular persons. And so, in like manner, the holy prophets, called kings and empires by the names of the heavenly luminaries. Their misfortunes and overthrow are represented by eclipses and extinction. Stars falling from the firmament are employed to denote the destruction of the nobility. Thunder and tempestuous winds, hostile invasions, lions, bears, leopards, goats or high trees, leaders of armies, conquerors, and founders of empires. Royal dignities described by purple or a crown, iniquity by spotted garments, error and misery by an intoxicating drought, a warrior by a sword or bow, a powerful man by a gigantic stature, and a judge by balance, weights, and measures. In a word, the prophetic style seems to be a speaking hieroglyphic. The whole mystical system of Pythagoras was expressed by signs and symbols, which the initiated understood, while the rest of the world, though in the midst of light, remained forever enveloped in the impenetrable shades of darkness. His secrets were forbidden to be committed to writing, and were delivered orally from one to another as ineffable mysteries. The Pythagoreans, so famous for their silence, conversed with each other chiefly by signs, a practice which was adopted not only as a universal language, but to conceal from the vulgar their peculiar doctrines and modes of thinking. Symbolical instruction, which was found so useful in impressing on the mind the most dilated and comprehensive truths, that it had been adopted from Masonry into all the mysteries, was in high esteem with Pythagoras. For he said, in treating of all things divine and human, the vastness of such a complicated subject demanded short symbols to help and assist the memory. This system was attended with other very important advantages. The method of communicating ideas by signs and symbols had in all ages given its possessors a decided advantage over the rest of the world, for, As generals used watchwords to distinguish their soldiers from others, so it is very advantageous to communicate to friends and brothers some peculiar signs and symbols as distinctive marks of a society. These among the Pythagoreans were a chain of indissoluble love. The Druids also possessed a profound system of hieroglyphics, the principles of which were communicated with great reluctance, even to the Epopte themselves. The characters of this species of symbol were borrowed from the appearance of natural objects and chiefly from the vegetable creation. Thus, of a man who possessed an expanded mind, it would be said, he is an oak, or another who was liable to be intimidated, was irresolute and wavering, he is an aspen leaf, or of a third who was hollow and deceitful, he is a reed. The knowledge of these symbols was properly denominated mystery, and the initiated were strictly forbade to commit any portion of it to writing. This method of concentrating the secrets of their order and fixing them permanently in the recollection by means of visible images was adopted to prevent the uninitiated from acquiring improperly any insight into their occult rites and disquisitions. Whatever was valuable in the system of Druidism was embodied in some visible and picturesque object, which thus became a depository of important truths. Hence, almost every object they saw could read them a lecture on morality, and hence, inanimate matter was said to speak with the lips of knowledge, and contemplation was assisted and enforced in every situation by the actual presence of those silent yet eloquent teachers of wisdom. Geometrical figures as lines, angles, squares, and perpendiculars were ranked amongst the symbols of Druidism. As the Druids had no enclosed temples, thinking them inconsistent with the majesty of the gods, so neither had they any carved images to represent them, and for the same reason, but instead thereof, rude stones were erected in their places of worship at some mystic, significant distance, and in some emblematic number, situation, and plan, sometimes in right lines, sometimes in squares, sometimes in triangles, sometimes in both, now single and 50 paces distant or more from the circles, or eminently taller than the rest in the circular line, and making a part of it like portals, not only to shape the entrance, but also to hollow those that entered. It appeared by many monuments that the Druids attributed great virtue to these passages between rocks. This custom was practiced in its greatest perfection and consequently with the most triumphant success in Egypt, the land of allegory as well as superstition. Those astonishing specimens of human art and ingenuity which still remain in that country to excite our wonder and admiration, not to mention the sphinxes, the obelisk, the catacombs, and other minor though stupendous masses of architecture. The gigantic pyramids, one of which, say the Copts, was erected by Ham, and the other by Shem, are generally regarded either as having been intended for tombs or repositories for hidden treasure in times of public agitation. Some indeed have conjectured that they were buildings appropriated to the occult purpose of practicing magical arts, and that the construction of talismans and charms. The truth, however, is that they were places principally used for the celebration of the mysteries, which were of great importance in Egypt, and derived additional celebrity from the splendor, solidity, or costliness of the place which was devoted to their solemnization. Now, the quadrangular pyramid contained many mysterious and symbolical references. It was supposed to allegorize the soul or the principle of immortality. And this opinion was not peculiar to Egypt, but was admitted by the Indians, the Chinese, and in the extremist regions of the West. For the high altar of Huitzilopochtli in Mexico was pyramidal, as was also the celebrated temple at Nankin. Sphinxes were erected in the front of temples and places of initiation, as we are informed by Clement of Alexandria, to denote that all sacred truth is enfolded in enigmatical fables and allegories. In their initiations, the Egyptians informed the candidate as an ineffable secret that the mysteries were received from Father Adam, Seth, and Enoch, and in the chief degree, the perfectly initiated aspirant was termed from the name of the deity Al-Omja, pronounced Al-Ha-Maya. After the initiation was fully completed, figs and honey were presented to the candidate, accompanied by this maxim: truth is sweet. The characteristic property of these mysteries was secrecy. Hence, among the innumerable emblems and hieroglyphical symbols with which they abounded, hence the great personification of silence or taciturnity so frequently recurring on all their sculptured monuments, and hence their incessant reference to darkness, which was an emblem expressive of the profound secrecy under which the initiated were bound by solemn obligations, enforced by denunciations of rigorous penalties. The symbol of this darkness resembled a mason's trowel. The reason assigned for this jealousy has been revealed to us by Apuleius. He says that in a subsequent part of his own initiation, the Hierophant produced certain mysterious writings or tracing boards which contained symbols explanatory of the whole system, expressed by figures of animals and secret marks interwoven with apparent intricacy. Now, revolving like a wheel, now turned inwards and crowded together, that the hidden meaning might be effectually concealed from the prying curiosity of the uninitiated. The symbolical instruction of Egypt was of unlimited extent. Everything in nature, everything mysterious, every branch of science, every technical phrase, and every component part of the mysteries were expressed by a significant and appropriate symbol. Hence arose the complicated inscriptions on tombs, obelisks, and temples, which are generally mere historical records, pointing out the name of the builder, with the addition of such moral precepts as the genius of the founder might suggest, and bearing a reference to the circumstances which occasioned the construction of the edifice. If they wished to express a powerful, brave, cunning, and avaricious king, they painted the figure of a man with the head of a lion, pointing with one of his fingers to a fox before him. If they wished to express the attributes of understanding, sagacity, and wisdom, they represented a man with the head of an elephant, pointing with one of his fingers to a sitting ape. If they wished to give him the attributes of justice, generosity, and liberality, they drew a man with a bird's head, and before him a balance, a sun, and a moon. If they meant to represent him cruel, faithless, and ignorant, they gave him a dog's, asses, or boar's head, with a pot of fire and a sword before him. A man of perfect wisdom and understanding, accomplished in all his ways and without the least blame, was painted with a beautiful face, with wings like an angel, holding in his hands a book in which he looked, a sword and a balance, and behind him 2 vases, one of them full of water and the other of blazing fire. Under his right foot a ball with a crab painted on it, and under his left a deep pot full of serpents, scorpions, and different reptiles, the covering of which had the shape of an eagle's head. Thus everything was enveloped in mystery. the key of which was initiation. The hidden meaning of the Egyptian hieroglyphics is now pretty well known and appears to be as follows. The world, governed by the providence of God, was symbolized by a circle, with a hawk-headed serpent in its center. The sun by a man or child enthroned upon the lotus or water lily. Honor and victory by a palm tree. Power and authority by a rod or staff. Secrecy by a grasshopper. Knowledge by an ant. Fecundity by a goat. Aversion by a wolf. Instability by a hyena. Malice by a crocodile. Destruction by a mouse. And deformity by a bear. Plenty was represented by the right hand with the fingers open, and protection by the left hand closed. Ignorance was depicted by a light spot in the midst of a darkened surface. If the omnipresence of God was dilated on, the idea was comprehended under the form of an infinitely extended circle, whose center is everywhere, but whose circumference is nowhere. His omnipotence was designated by a human foot, and his boundless mercy by a cherub. Did the initiated refer to the four elements? They were portrayed by certain prismatic colors. White represented the air, blue the water, purple the earth, and crimson the fire. Again, the visible characters used to represent the elements were these. The four elements: air, water, earth, fire. Did they contemplate the creation of the world? It was fixed in their minds under the idea of the supreme serpent god Neph ejecting from his mouth an egg. Did they embody in their imagination the hero god Osiris? He was ever present under the form of a bull, which was considered an incarnation of the god and a symbol of the sun. If his mystical death and subsequent reviviscency were the subject of their devout thoughts, these fundamental points were figured under a butterfly, and the physical changes which distinguish that remarkable insect. If they contemplated the same mythological personage in the character of the sovereign of the universe, he was designed by a scepter and an eye. If under the form of the sun, he was symbolized by a frog, or of the great father rising regenerated from the waters of the deluge. The symbol was the same reptile emerging from the lotus. The zodiac was considered as the great assembly of the 12 gods, the sun being supreme and the planets his attendants. The human soul was depicted by a hawk, and the universe by a beetle. Life by this figure. It was also represented by that celebrated symbol, the crux ansata. Represented death, sin, angel, and devil. If immortality were the subject of their contemplation, it was engrafted on their minds by the idea of a serpent annually casting and renewing his skin. And if their hearts were exalted to the eternal God seated on his throne in heaven, he was figured as an august being of a purple color, shadowed with beams of glory. Such is an outline of the hieroglyphical system of Egypt, which formed the actuating principle of their scheme of politics as well as religion, but it was stained with licentiousness and obscenity, which ultimately brought upon it the execration of the wise and good. I must not omit to mention, however, that this people contrived to embody the whole of their symbols in one mystical diagram, which was esteemed a constellation of the secrets perpetuated in the mysteries. I subjoin the emblem, but leave the explanation of it to your own ingenuity and research. The system of symbolical instruction in all other mysteries was commensurate with this. The emblems, which Masons now make use of as the secret repositories of their treasures of morality, were adopted by the ancients in very early times as signs and symbols, and thus were even substituted for alphabetical characters. Thus, in the ancient alphabet of the Virgin, the square was used to express the letter S. In the alphabet of Socrates, it stood for Z or TH. And as an hieroglyphic, it denoted equally a building and a learned man, according to the different situations in which it was placed. A circle supported by two perpendicular parallel lines denoted will and pleasure. And in the lunar alphabet, the same character represented the letter Y. In the alphabet of Taurus, a point within a circle stood for R, in the lunar alphabet for H, in the solar alphabet for B, in Aristotle's alphabet for W and U, in that of Hermes for A, and in the Egyptian hieroglyphics it represented a star. The triangle, now called a trowel, was an emblem of very extensive application, and was much revered by ancient nations as containing the greatest and most abstruse mysteries. It signified equally the deity, creation, and fire. In the alphabet of the moon, it represented the letter S. And in the hieroglyphics of Egypt, we sometimes see the suppliant representing a triangle to his god. The mallet was a symbol of Thor, the northern god of thunder. In the alphabet of Balinos, it was used to express the letter M. In that of Plato, L. In that of Hermes, B. In the Indian alphabet, A. In the alphabet of Hermes, Abutat, the mallet united with a pickaxe denoted R. In that of Jupiter, N. And in the Barabian alphabet, Z. In the alphabet of Pythagoras, the compasses stood for S. In that of Diosmos the Egyptian, for F. And in the oldest Chaldean alphabet, the square and compasses united, as they are in our third degree of Masonry, was a character used to represent the letter H. In the alphabet of Saturn, the plum stood for S, and a skull for T. In that of India, a chisel stood for A. In that of Hermes, a double cross supporting a circle for SHR. And two parallel lines for Y. And in the solar alphabet, a sun represented the first letter A. We have here a fund of pleasant research offered for our investigation, which cannot fail to repay the active Mason for any extent of labor he may be induced to bestow upon it. And I must recommend you to apply yourselves assiduously to this curious and amusing study. In the prosecution of such an useful and instructive pursuit, do not suffer yourself to be abstracted by the idiot laugh of ridicule, or the cynical sneer of contempt, but proceed in an undeviating course to the investigation of truth, assured that the beautiful results will amply reward your labors. If you practice masonry for the sake of its convivialities alone, it will soon pall on your mind, for these are introduced into the system only to cheer and relieve nature after its pain and unwearied researches into the hidden stores of Masonic knowledge. But if your mind embraced the great principles of Masonry as the chief source of gratification and used its lighter shades of enjoyment as merely temporary relaxations when the hour of graver labor has expired, you will enjoy then every benefit this science can impart. Your expanding genius will soon be imbued with all the vigor of a healthy intellect, matured and ripened by a rich increase of scientific and religious knowledge, and your mind, rapidly advancing to perfection, will ultimately be prepared for the full irradiations of complete and never fading glory when time shall be no more.